So greetings, medical microbiology students. So this is my first attempt at recording a lecture. So bear with me as I'm trying to figure out all the details and how to work the technology. I think I've got a pretty good handle on it. Hopefully the audio quality is good and hopefully the lecture quality is good as well. It's obviously not quite as good as doing it in person, but I think this is a little bit better than just having everybody flip through the PowerPoint slides. Hope everyone is staying healthy. Please do email me or give me a call if you have any questions. I'll do my best to answer them in a reasonable amount of time. So we're going to pick up and look at topic 12. We had done the first part of topic 12 in class, and today I want to finish the second part of topic 12, which is on mechanisms. So I showed you this slide before in class. This was talking about this whole idea about how a pathogen can actually cause disease. Because of course we're exposed to bacteria and viruses all the time. We don't always get sick. Some of them colonize us, live in our gut, live on our skin, and we're not sick. So that question of, what it does, what it takes to be a pathogen, that means pathogenicity, what it means to be able to cause disease. And there's actually quite a number of variables involved here, which our textbook is calling requirements for infection, but infection is just part of it, also causing disease. So you can see there's a number of variables here, and we're going to go through each of them one by one. You can see here the first part is they have to get in, they have to invade in reasonable numbers, and they have to attach to your body. Second part is they have to somehow get past host defenses and get inside the body in some cases. The third part is actually causing some sort of damage to the body. These are called cytopathic effects. And then lastly, of course, if they're going to get in the body, they have to get out if they want to infect other people. So let's dive right in and take a look at these things. So the first thing are the portals of entry, meaning there are many routes of entry for organisms to get in the body, and some of them do have preferred portals of entry, which means that if they go in one, they may not cause any issues, whereas if they go in the other, they may cause issues. So you can see some examples here. We have the oral route. So some diseases typically will go in through some sort of oral or respiratory route. So that would include the nose and the mouth, and of course down into those systems, whether it's the gut or the respiratory systems. So you can think, of course, we have this new coronavirus, rhinoviruses that cause the common cold, influenza viruses, measles, a bunch of viruses go in that way. Of course, anything that's going to cause you most waterborne and food illnesses go in the gut through the mouth somehow. We also have the sexual route, of course, of which is we're talking about sexually transmitted diseases such as chlamydia or gonorrhea, and also down there anatomically, of course, is the urethra is down there as well, which can also lead to things like bladder or kidney infections. And some of the same organisms, so E. coli and gonorrhea, for example, can be causes of urinary tract infections. The skin, of course, is a route of entry, and sometimes we call that the parenteral route, meaning injection by some sort. You can see I have some examples there, broken skin or insect bites, those kind of things, penetrating the skin and getting access to some of the tissues underneath and also the bloodstream can be the route of entry for quite a number of diseases. There's also the placental route. There is a distinction, though, between mother to fetus. Some diseases can go through the placenta to the fetus during pregnancy. You can see I have 3 examples there: syphilis, toxoplasma, and Zika virus. All are known to gain access to the fetus and can cause birth abnormalities. There are other diseases that are mother to child, and many of them actually are more likely to happen during childbirth than actually during the pregnancy. So HIV is a good example of this, in that HIV has been known in some cases to cross the placenta, but is more likely, the bigger risk is actually during childbirth, when the mother's blood and the baby's blood may have a chance to be mixed. but a lot less likely during pregnancy. So you can see this note here is that just because a pathogen enters your body, it doesn't mean it's going to cause disease. So for example, Streptococcus pneumonia, if it gets in your lungs, can cause pneumonia, no surprise there. But if people ingest it and it gets inside your intestine, you're not likely to get any type of disease. Here's another example. Salmonella is usually causing a gastrointestinal kind of disease, but on your skin, it's not usually causing you any issues. So B is the number of invading organisms, or the infectious dose. You can see that we actually have a number for this. It's called the ID50, which is measured in a lab, which is the estimated number of pathogens required to cause disease in 50% of individuals. So it's a specific number that looks at what we think the infectious dose is. So if you have less than that number, you're unlikely to get disease. If you have more than that number, you're likely to get disease. Of course, there's always differences between individuals. So you can see the two examples I have there. I have E. coli 0157. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. This is the really nasty pathogenic E. coli. This is the one that you hear about in the news. Comes from cow manure, and sometimes it infects things like lettuce or hamburgers or something like that. Most pathogenic E. coli, so we're talking about traveler's diarrhea, you can see the numbers are in the millions. That are going to cause some sort of infection. So that means if you're drinking contaminated water when you go to Mexico, you're drinking a lot of E. coli before you get that traveler's diarrhea. E. coli 0157, you can see the infectious dose is estimated to be less than 100 cells, which means it's very, very serious. It doesn't take a lot in order to make people sick. Here's some other examples. You can see I have cholera there. The numbers again are relatively high. Cholera tends to be individual specific. Some people are more susceptible than others. Inhalation anthrax, you can see, is a little bit smaller, in the thousands rather than the millions. You can see some other examples. HPV causing warts and genital warts, about 10,000. Norovirus, you can see right here, norovirus, very low infectious dose. So norovirus, we kind of talked about a little bit here and there this semester. Often causes illness in daycares and cruise ships, and causes diarrhea and vomiting, very, very common. Sometimes it's called the winter vomiting bug, and it doesn't take much for it to be transmitted from one person to another, particularly with fluids like vomit and diarrhea, and only 20 viral particles. You can see down here, very last on the list, I have smallpox, variola, and Zaire ebolavirus, which we're not going to do these tests, but it is believed from the available evidence that one virus particle may be enough to cause disease, which obviously makes these particular diseases very, very terrifying. Part C is adherence, meaning the ability to attach to host cells. So you can see I'm talking about these things called adhesions. So there's that IN again. IN meaning a protein. These are proteins. Right here you can see I'm going to color in one on this E. coli. It's a protein on the surface of E. coli that's allowing it to bind to a host cell. So you can see down here we've got this host cell receptor, and this adhesion is binding it. So for example, E. coli, as I mentioned previously, can cause bladder infections, and but not every E. coli can cause bladder infections. Only some E. coli strains actually have the correct adhesins to attach to bladder cells. So this is why some people rarely get bladder infections. They don't have the right E. coli, or the wrong E. coli, I guess. Other people may have the wrong E. coli in their intestine, and so they end up with recurring bladder infections because, of course, particularly in women, the anus and the urethra are very, very close anatomically, and so it doesn't take much for E. coli to get to the wrong place. And if they have the wrong E. coli with those adhesins, it can cause bladder infections. Another way to attach to host cells are glycocalyx. If you remember glycocalyx, glyco means carbohydrate, and so carbohydrate, and calyx means coat, C-O-A-T. So these are carbohydrates on the surface of some bacteria. You can see on the left here, this is a capsule. We also talked about slime layers as well. And these can be relatively sticky things. And they're carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are just different from proteins in that they're made of saccharides. So the relatively sticky things, this diagram on the left is showing a streptococcus attached to a tonsil cell. So this is the organism that causes strep throat, and it's able to attach. Without that capsule, it can't attach and can't actually cause strep throat. On the right is just a stain showing capsules, and you can see this halo around these cells. The stain doesn't bind the capsule, and so it looks like a little halo. A lot of parasites have all sorts of different attachment mechanisms, suckers and hooks and things like that. You can see they're showing the left two images are tapeworms with sucker discs and hooks, and that's how they attach and hold on to their host. On the right we have a fluke also with suckers. I don't exactly know how they work. I just imagine there's something like suction cups, although they clearly have little barbs in them as well that allows them to hold on to the host tissue. So part D is talking about penetration and evasion of host defenses. I'm going to talk about two things, things that help penetrate host cells and things that help evade host defenses. First one, something we talked about, are these things called the apical complex, which is a group of organisms called the apicomplexa. You can see the note there. And there's three organisms that we talked about that are apicomplexa. There's a whole bunch, of course, but the important ones that we're talking about are Plasmodium. Plasmodium, this is the one that causes malaria. Toxoplasma, this is the one associated with cat feces. And Cryptosporidium, this is the one associated with cow manure. And all of these have apical complexes. So on the right you can see an apical complex. It's kind of like a little bit of a mechanical and enzymatic drill that allows them to penetrate host cells. So all of these organisms can actually. Another group of things that are worth talking about are the invasins and exoenzymes, which sometimes those words are used interchangeably. You can see invasin, it says extracellular substances which allow bacteria to penetrate host cells. And so if you look here, this is showing an example of Listeria or Salmonella, and they're binding to a host cell and they're secreting something, and that something is allowing, or it's actually giving a message to the host cell to bring in this little bacterium by endocytosis. So you can see over here on the right, like I said, this is an example of Salmonella, and Salmonella can live internally, which makes it hard to treat with antibiotics. Here's another example. This is Treponema pallidum, which is the organism that causes syphilis. And these have those endoflagella, and they can corkscrew through tissues, but they also secrete enzymes that allow them to penetrate different host cells. This is why syphilis can be very serious after the initial sexually transmitted symptoms, such as genital blisters. Once it starts invading other tissues, it can be very, very serious. Particularly in later stages, syphilis can be known to invade the brain, which can be obviously very serious. There are many, many exoenzymes out there. There's a whole table in the textbook that covers them. We did talk about one already, which are these hemolysins. So hemolysins, hemolysis is breaking open of red blood cells. In, that means proteins. You can see on the right there's some beta hemolysis, so these bacteria are secreting hemolysins, which destroy the red blood cells or lyse them and help them to invade those tissues when they're causing an infection. So here's another example here. These are enzymes are usually named after some sort of connective tissue that they're dissolving. So you can see, for example, collagenase. So that means it's digesting collagen. So collagen is a stringy protein that's found all over your body in connective tissue and skin. And these enzymes dissolve it, and so they allow the organisms to cause some sort of invasion to somebody's tissues. You can see this is including Clostridium. I'm not exactly sure which Clostridium this is referring to without looking it up, but you can see they're invading the tissues here. So here's an example of an organism that secretes exoenzymes and dissolves connective tissue. This is Streptococcus Pyogenes, this is the same organism that causes strep throat. It can cause a number of other infections. In some rare cases, it can cause this particular condition called necrotizing fasciitis, also known as flesh-eating disease. And sorry for the graphic image, but you can see that the tissue is clearly being digested away by the organism. And this is due to secretion of these extracellular enzymes. So capsules, we were just talking about capsules and slime layers as glycocalyx. These are things that not only allow them to attach to things like tonsil cells, I showed you in the previous slide, but they also make it harder for immune cells to grab onto them. And so you can see here's an example here of there's an immune cell there, and of course the capsule, like I said, is kind of slimy. Slime layers obviously are much goopier, and the immune cell just can't bind it. And so the pathogen is able to escape phagocytosis. So a good example of this is Streptococcus. As I mentioned, Streptococcus pyogenes that causes strep throat. There's other Streptococcus, of course. Pneumonia is another one. And when the immune cells can't grab onto it, it takes a little bit longer for the immune response to happen, and therefore the organism can actually cause disease. So something else pathogens can do is they can vary their antigens. That means that they change the structures on their surface. So it's harder for the immune system to recognize what they're looking at. So we already talked about the influenza virus way back in topic 6 when we were talking about antigenic drift and antigenic shift. This is a virus that mutates slowly or sometimes rapidly if we're talking about shift. And it's mutating these surface structures, so hemagglutinin, H, and neuraminidase, N. So the H1N1, for example, describes the flu virus. And there are many organisms that do this. Malaria, so Plasmodium causes malaria, also has the ability to change its surface proteins on a regular basis, which makes it harder for us to mount an immune response, and people can get reinfected from malaria every single year if exposed. Another way to invade host defenses is to hide, and so you can hide inside the host cell. So in intracellular growth, it's a good way to hide from the immune system. Here's a list of a bunch of organisms that do this. So you can see Mycobacterium tuberculosis right here. Oops, right here. There's another mycobacterium that causes leprosy. Listeria is a good example. Salmonella, Yersinia pestis that causes plague. Rickettsia, we're not really talking about that in this course. And chlamydia, which is a sexually transmitted infection. Okay, so part E is damage to host cells. This is where we're actually causing disease in many cases, meaning the organism isn't just infecting you or colonizing you, but it's actually causing some sort of pathology, some sort of damage. So we're going to distinguish between cytopathic effects and cytological effects. So cytopathic effects means damage to the host cell. So it means the virus, for example, is actually destroying host cells. So in the case of something like Ebola, it's destroying a lot of tissues, and people in some extreme cases are actually bleeding out because their tissues are getting damaged. Cytological effects often is referring to endotoxins or exotoxins, or in some case superantigens. So things that they're secreting or releasing that are causing damage to host cells. We'll talk about these in a moment. So cytopathic effects, you can see here, here's some cytopathic effects of the herpes simplex virus. So this is the one that causes cold sores or genital herpes. This cell here actually represents a relatively normal cell. So you can see the nucleus is a certain size, it's a relatively regular shape. But over here on the right, all these cells over here, there are viruses replicating in them. And the cells, they don't grow to normal sizes. Their nucleus is a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. They're often funny shaped, and in many cases these cells are broken or dying. And so this causes, ultimately a blister when they're destroying all those tissues. So cytological effects. I want to talk about different types of toxins. Endo and exotoxins. So the word endo means inside, And so endotoxins are things that are actually inside bacteria. There's actually a few endotoxins. You can actually go look in your textbook. You can see I have this note here about tables 5.3 and 5.4. Check them out if you're interested in seeing a list of a whole bunch of these things. The main thing, though, when people talk about endotoxin, is they're talking about something found in gram-negative bacteria. So if you remember gram-negative bacteria, they have two membranes. So we've got the plasma membrane, so PM for plasma membrane, and then we have the outer membrane, OM for outer membrane. And that outer membrane has these unique lipids. These unique lipids are called LPS. LPS actually stands for lipopolysaccharide. Won't expect you to know that, but maybe you will need to know that for other courses. So this is just part of their membrane. And so you can see as the cell gets destroyed, let's say maybe the person gets some antibiotics, it kills the cell, and now you have these endotoxins released, these lipids that are unique to gram-negative organisms. So what happens is that if this happens in your bloodstream, now you have foreign particles in your bloodstream, and your immune system recognizes it as something that is foreign. So this can lead to something called septic shock. So septic shock, you're looking at fever, low blood pressure, those kind of things. In some cases, it can lead to much more severe symptoms, including death. It can be very, very serious in some cases. This is why in some cases we don't actually give people antibiotics if they have a bloodborne infection in all cases, because we got to weigh what the risks are going to be. We don't want to be releasing too many endotoxins at one time. Here's a little diagram from the textbook. You can see we've got this phagocyte, that's an immune cell, and the immune cell is releasing or destroying these bacteria, and in that process these endotoxins are getting released, and you can see they're getting into the bloodstream. Over on the right side you can see a bacteria is just dying from other causes. Either way, endotoxins in the bloodstream can cause symptoms caused by the immune system. So endotoxins are one thing. What can be actually much more serious and even more potent are these exotoxins. So you can see endotoxins, we're mostly talking about this thing, this LPS found in the gram-negative cell membrane, outer membrane. Exotoxins are things that are secreted, and there are more examples from gram-positive organisms. So you can see this gram-positive organism here is living, and it's secreting these exotoxins, and they're getting out into the environment. Some of them are waste products, some of them are helping them to invade tissues. They're not necessarily trying to cause damage to the host, but in many cases they do, and some are very, very potent. So let's talk about some of them. So here's some living bacteria. You can see they're secreting these exotoxins and destroying the host tissues. So here's a list of a bunch of exotoxins. You can review it on your own time. I want to talk about 2 or 3 in particular. One is the botulinum toxin. You can see this is found in a Clostridium organism. So Clostridium botulinum. This is a soil organism. It forms endospores. You can see here's some endospores here forming. And if you haven't guessed from this slide, it causes botulism. So botulism is a type of paralysis that people can get and can be very, very serious. You may have also noticed from this slide, this is the toxin, and it is also called the Botox toxin, interestingly enough. We'll come back to that in a moment. So what does this do? This basically inhibits nerves, between nerves and muscles. So you can see here's a normal a neuron on the right here. Right here is the neuron. The signal is going to go down the neuron, and it's going to be received in the muscle here, down here. And in between, you've got this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine that tells the muscle to contract. With the botulinum toxin, you can see right here, it is basically blocking that signal. So paralysis happens. So as I mentioned, this is also known as the Botox toxin. In very, very small amounts, it can actually have therapeutic value. You can see over here on the left, we have a woman that is having issues with her muscles in her forehead, and she clenches all the time. This causes headaches and other things. Some people have this issue so bad they can't even see, their eyes are closed. They inject a little Botox locally, and she's able to relax a little bit. Side effect of this too, people found out, is it actually makes your skin look a little smoother, and therefore there's many celebrities that are using Botox, which I'm sure you're not surprised. I googled Botox. I found many celebrities that are on Botox, or at least websites that speculate they are. Here's one, Hillary Clinton. Um, you can see she's definitely looking a little smoother and maybe a little more youthful. Um, I'm not judging her. I don't blame her. She is a politician, and sometimes appearance can be very, very important for those things. I think in particular, if you're a woman, it's a very hard career path to have, particularly in the United States. Another related toxin is the tetanus toxin. So you can see this is another Clostridium organism, so Clostridium tetani, also a soil organism, also forms endospores. And basically this does kind of the opposite thing that the Botox toxin does. This actually causes, rather than paralysis, causes muscles to stay contracted. Here's a picture of, or not a picture, a painting of a wounded soldier, and you can see his muscles are clenched and it's very painful. Tetanus is also known as lockjaw. Some people end up with locked muscles in their jaw, and they can't unclench them. So here's a diagram showing what's going on with the tetanus toxin. You can see over here we're talking about acetylcholine, which is shown right here. This is the neurotransmitter that tells the muscle to contract. And then over here they're talking about inhibitory neurotransmitters that say time to relax. So tetanus blocks those inhibitory neurotransmitters, so the muscles can't relax. And like I said, this can be very, very painful. So here's another exotoxin I wanted to mention. This is actually in a group called enterotoxins. So this word entero, if you ever see the word entero, it basically means your gut or your GI tract. And so we might talk about enteroinvasive organisms or enterotoxins, or we've got enterococcus, which is an organism that infects the gut. This is the cholera toxin. It's kind of interesting. This is also called an AB toxin. You can see we have these two parts. The B part, this is the part that basically binds and recognizes the host cell. And then the A part is the part that actually does the damage. So in this case, the damage is modifying chloride channels, which changes your water balance in your gut, which leads to a crazy amount of diarrhea. So two things I want to point out here. A is just throw down that term enterotoxin. And B, I want to show there are actually a number of toxins that follow this AB trend. So for example, we have the pertussis toxin and the diphtheria toxin are AB toxins. So these are important because we actually have vaccines against pertussis and diphtheria. And the way it works is we genetically modify these things. So here I'm just trying to cross that out. We get rid of the part that does the damage to humans, so we can genetically do that. And then we keep the other part. And so this other part is actually what makes our vaccine. We have vaccines against the toxins, or at least the part of the toxins that bind the human cells. And so you can do this safely by eliminating the A part, which causes the damage. So another group of things that aren't really toxins, there's something called superantigens. And so if you've ever used women's sanitary products such as tampons, you may have noticed the warning labels about toxic shock syndrome. So in this case here, what they're warning against is a certain protein that's found in some organisms, particularly Staphylococcus. And this protein can lead to a massive immune response, which is very similar to septic shock. We're talking about fever, low blood pressure, sometimes organ failure, and death. And it doesn't just happen in women, but it can happen in women. This became a little bit more commonly known about, I believe it was in the 1980s, where there were, believe it or not, companies that were producing some sort of super tampon that women would be allowed to leave in for multiple days. It's pretty much as gross as it sounds, and if you think about what you're doing if you leave it in too long, you're looking at producing a blood culture. and this gives a chance for the Staphylococcus to grow. And with more Staphylococcus, you get more of these proteins, and with more of these proteins, particularly if it gets into your blood, this can lead to this toxic shock, which is, like I said, mostly an immune response. So the warnings are on tampons, because of course these are the products associated with it, but it is a pretty rare thing, and men do get toxic shock syndrome sometimes, obviously not from tampons, but basically from getting Staphylococcus in the blood. Okay, so I think this video is probably getting long enough at this point, so I'm going to stop now and take a little break, and I will finish this topic in the next video, which will be part 3 of topic 12.